Meine lieben Damen und Herren, ich hoffe, Sie hatten alle eine
So,
angenehme
ladies and gentlemen, I
Mittagspause
hope
bei
that you
dem
liked your
sehr
lunch
schönen Wetter
break.
draußen.
Given
Ich glaube, es
the
hat
weather
allen
wonderful
gefallen
as
und hoffe
the
es auch.
weather
Und
outside
ja,
is wonderful.
ohne weitere Umschweifungen machen wir
Well, and
jetzt
without
gleich
further
weiter. Wir haben jetzt ja
ado,
noch ein
we will
straffes Programm.
continue.
Bitte, Herr
We
Dr.
have
Barth, Sie haben
quite a
das Wort.
tight agenda ahead.
Wir
Dr.
fahren
Barth,
also mit den
the
Anhörungen
floor is
fort
yours.
und wenden
Yes,
uns
we
dem
will
Bereich
proceed to the next
der
interviews,
Bekleidungsindustrie
and we will
zu
now deal with the
und zur
textile
Einführung in
industry
die Besonderheiten
next day.
dieses Industriezweiges
And to introduce
erteile
us
ich
to
wieder Herrn
the
Dr. Sachse das Wort.
specificities of this industry, I would like to hand the floor over to Dr. Sachse again. So, on the textile industry, I would like to say the following. In the 1940s already, a very cruel form of forced labor with women was used, which was in the early GDR's prisons. There, female prisoners were used to repair or to dismantle uniforms or to dye them anew. At first sight, it seems to be irregular sewing work, but these uniforms hadn't been washed before that. So for the work process of dyeing, there were no protective gloves or any other protective equipment, and the changing of the uniforms happened in basement rooms, in attics, or in adjacent buildings that had hardly any heating, hardly any ventilation, hardly any illumination. For this very reason, the work, which is hard in itself, became even harder. The rest of the textiles and clothing industry was split up into the production of a number of textile branches, and as we all know, the GDR had no freely available Western currency, so that goods from West Germany were paid with cheap contract manufactured goods, in part textiles that had been manufactured in the GDR. For example, the DDR in 1976 bought 1 billion Deutsche Marks convertible currencies worth of machines and electrotechnical equipment from West Germany, and it was paid for with cheaply manufactured clothing and textiles. This swap business had as a prerequisite for the labor to be very cheap and for the products to be produced in big masses. So if the rest of the market wasn't able to cater to this, prices would be lowered, with which income was lower also, and the quantities had to be increased. So this additional quantity above the target figures of the planned fulfillment were put and placed on the shoulders of the prisoners. This meant a lot of pressure on the prisoners who had to do this work, and also on the prison administrations, who passed on the pressure down to the prisoners. We can mention Planet Eppendorf as an example of a company, then a combine for tights and stockings, Esda Thalheim for lady stockings, and Hoheneck prisoners produced in overtime shifts and under inhuman production conditions these products. These lady stockings and tights were offered by West German department stores and retail chains, amongst them Kaufhof, Quelle and Neckermann. With the sale of ladies' tights and stockings made by Esda, quite a lot of profit was to be gained, which was admitted to in 1990. The GDR sold one pair of ladies' tights for 1 Deutschmark and 25 cents, that is Pfennig, and the purchase prices for the Western retail chains was 22 Pfennig, that is cents. So in the West already the profit margin was high. At the same time, the GDR did not have to have any profit margin because it was all about bringing foreign currency into the country, bringing money in. Then there was another way of production, which has been described repeatedly as very hard. This is production in the shoe combine in the city of Weissenfels, where shoes were made in a certain production process, and that meant special hardships for the prisoners. There were a great number of prisoners who simply couldn't do it for months or years and simply collapsed. Production was, amongst other places, for the textile fabrics and production halls of Görlitz, Magdeburg, Burg Eppendorf, Elsterberg, and Greiz. I think I said enough at this point. Thanks a lot, Dr. Sachse, for introducing the textile industry to us. I now call as a first witness for this industry area, Ms. Angelica Schmidt. The floor is yours.
Could you please introduce yourself for 5 minutes, and then we're going to ask you about your working conditions. Thank you. My name is Angelica Schmidt. I was born in 1955. I was born in Saxony-Anhalt. Between 1962 and 1970, I went to school, the secondary school in Merseburg. And then from 1970 to 1974, I was at the Russian Special School in Vickersdorf in Thuringia. This is a school with a Stasi sponsorship contract, as I heard from Ines Geibel last year, who also was at that school for 3 years. In 1974, after finishing school, I got married. My husband had just finished his studies as a construction engineer, and he was supposed to start his military service. We were aware that I'm sorry, I just forgot the word. It would have meant desertion, and so if he had deserted, the paragraph of espionage would also have been applicable. And this is why our ideas to leave the GDR had, were somehow accelerated. And in 1975, we used falsified passports to go from Budweis to Vienna. Unfortunately, we were arrested and were sentenced to 2.5 years of imprisonment. And I came to Hoheneck. But I have to say the following, as I was a daughter of a party member and my father had connections to the Stasi, I was offered the following. If I was willing to go back to the GDR, I wouldn't have to go to prison. But I would in return have to report about the inhabitants of our house. So that was a type of spying they asked me to do, and when I got aware of this, I refused this offer. I then was sent to Hoheneck. I was assigned to the VEB Planet And I thought that this was the state security harassing me because I had no idea of sewing and I wasn't interested in it. But then I heard that the other women at ESTA had to manufacture pantyhose. They had to pull the pantyhose over a very hot device and they got burned. And in other companies, I heard about similar things from others. I spoke with 2 prisoners who had got injured heavily at the hand, and the wound got inflamed, and they were afraid they couldn't do their proper work anymore because they were dentists. So I had the lesser evil, so to speak. So this is it for the moment. So you still have a few moments. The 5 minutes haven't elapsed yet. So I can tell you how things continued. Unfortunately, we were not released to the West, as my father's had ties, connection to the Ministry of State Security. We had to wait for 3 years until the Federal Republic of Germany could pay a ransom for us, which was a very long time for us, because most of the people were bought free after half of their imprisonment having passed, after 2/3 at the latest. For us, it really meant 30 months of prison and another 18 months in the GDR. So all in all, 48 months. This was a very long and hard time, mentally, a mental strain on us. In 1979, 4 years later, we moved to the West. We settled in Wiesbaden. Hessen is strongly represented here today, as I've noticed. I have a training for a medical technical assistant that I underwent. And in Mainz at the University Clinic for Medical Microbiology. It was when I worked until I had parental leave and I stayed at home for 7 months. 7 years, excuse me. And then I started working in my husband's gynecological practice until retirement. What I forgot, after leaving school, I was at a special school to prepare to become a Russian teacher. And this is what I also started. So much on my biography. So thank you very much for your information on your life. And now we're going to turn to your work you did for the VEB Planet and the bed linen and shirts combined Lößnitz. Mr. Lee would like to ask you. As you have described, there was no occupational safety, no protection measures. Can you specify this? Well, there was no work clothing provided. We were led to the manufacturing site right away, coming from our cells. On our way to work, I once witnessed a very severe accident where a person was physically punished. So it was stated through the loudspeakers, the PA system, that we should get ready for work, and that didn't work at that day. And the female guard opened the cell doors and started yelling, "Why aren't you ready? Why haven't you put on your jackets?" And I was standing closest to her, and I answered in a calm voice that there was no announcement. Maybe the loudspeaker didn't work. She grabbed me. She pushed me against the rack of the bed. She beat me up from top to bottom. from the left to the right. I didn't even know if she was hitting me with her fists or with the baton. Even the criminal offenders, the fellow prisoners, were really flabbergasted because it was completely for no reason. And at the workplace, the managers there, I didn't witness any physical penalties. There were verbal attacks. I remember a violin player, she couldn't fulfill the plan, and she was called as a lazy pig. So these things like that. No protective equipment, no protective clothing, obsolete machinery. And one thing happened to me one night. The night shifts were very hard to do. I've never been a night person. And you couldn't sleep a lot because there were always noise. You couldn't do anything to make for the cell to be dark so that you could sleep during the day after your shift. And during the week, obviously, I didn't have the strength anymore, and I produced a product that wasn't perfect. We had to produce the shirts, and I brought you one of these shirts, and I had to saw these slits, these parts here. This is what we had to do. Just again, for the audience, these are the shirts that we had to produce, and I had to produce these slits. And I never learned how to do this, and I wasn't very talented. I didn't fulfill the target, and everything went wrong that night. So I made a mistake. The shirt wasn't good enough. I noticed it, and usually you weren't allowed to rise. You had to stay seated at the machine, and then the next machine was right next to me. And I wanted to see how much scrap I had produced, because that would have meant that I didn't fulfill the plan, and then a high scrap rate that would have been punished with arrest. And in 1974, a year ago, I fell ill from lung tuberculosis. I was very scared of being under arrest. So I stood up and went around the machine, and a knife was fixed to the sewing machine, but don't imagine it as a knife in the household, but it was a kind of a blade, like a blade to shave. And the slits were cut there. So I went around the table and I got hurt. I hurt my thigh. I had a wound 2 centimeters long and 3 millimeters of width, and it was bleeding very heavily. And by no means did I want to go to the supervisors, or the guards. I did not want to say this. And 2 prisoners saw it, and they helped me to stop the bleeding with some tissue that we had, some residues of the sewing process, so we could stop the bleeding. I still have a scar. Many scars can't be seen anymore, but the Hoheneck scar is still visible. So occupational safety measures, there were none. Thank you very much. I have a request for the floor by Mr. Badanam and by Ms. Pinarova, but Mr.
Excuse me, please.
Yeah, it's okay. I'll wait for you. While I'm waiting for it, I want to a little bit mention about the situation in North Korea as well. The paying the ransom is not available in North Korea. Even though the political prison camp still exists, but North Korea officially denied the political prison camp exists. So the paying ransom is not available, and around like 100,000 people in political prison camp, they still suffering. I really hope the ransom system, it could be possible for North Korean cases. So while you are waiting for paying ransom from West Germany, was there any changes, differences for your living conditions or working conditions? Because you'll be released to West Germany, so probably they could be mean to you or aware from something.
Unfortunately, our situation did not improve. While we were waiting, we had to be in prison until the very last day of our sentence. No probation. We were released as free people after being in prison. My husband was no longer allowed to work in his profession. He was supposed to work as a construction worker after our time in prison. I was supposed to work as a warehouse assistant in a vegetable store. We did not want to accept this because we had fully complied with our prison sentence. We then went to the Protestant church in Leipzig and we applied for jobs as assistant nurses. And we were successful. And both of us in different institutions worked as nurses. But we were not given back our identity cards. We could no longer go to Berlin after being at the permanent residence in Berlin, representation in Berlin. So we were second-class citizens without any rights. And we only met friends that had endured the same anymore. Otherwise, we were very mistrustful. That was how our life passed during these 18 months. Thank you very much. I have many different questions, many things I would like to ask you, but I'm going to limit myself to 2 questions. You spoke about your accident. My question is, have you been financially compensated? By the GDR authorities. Was there a kind of social security you could benefit from during your stay in prison? And the second question is, were you punished if you didn't fulfill the plan? You said that you had problems to meet the required target. Yes, there were sanctions. If you didn't meet the target, or if the guards had the feeling that you didn't want to meet the target, they were very strict opponents to the regime. I remember one female friend, at midnight when I passed, she had already fulfilled her target. And then she didn't do more intentionally to not support the state. But if they had the suspicion that you intentionally fell short of meeting the target, they would definitely have taken action had they had that feeling. I don't know if they noticed that I wasn't able to, if they realized it. In any event, if you didn't meet the target, that could be interpreted as refusal to work, and that would have meant 3 weeks of arrest. I was never subjected to that, but you are right. It was punished arbitrarily. And with regard to your second question, of course, we were not compensated for our work. But I hadn't notified my accident. That maybe I would have needed to, but I didn't think I would benefit from that at all if I had notified it. There was no compensation. We have heard that you were assigned a certain work for which you didn't have any qualification at all. So I interpret that you didn't have the choice to choose a different type of work. No. Okay, so next question. You said that you had to stay seated and you wouldn't have been allowed to stand up. That would have been awkward. What if you had to go to the toilet? How could that happen? Could you go to the bathroom if you needed to go? Yes, that was allowed, but we had to tell the guards, but they had an eye on how long we would be away from our workplace. So they paid attention to that, and if you took too long, they would enter the bathroom to see where you were. Okay, so the next question, I assume that in your sentence did not contain the clause that you were sentenced to carry out work in prison. No. We've heard that several times already. And you worked in a 3-shift system. What about the pauses, the breaks? Here we know we are used to having a break if we need it after an appropriate period of time. So what about your situation? A short break was possible after 4 hours, half-time. What happened? Could you go outside? Could you drink something? No, we were not led outside. We stayed at the workplace, and we couldn't drink anything. So this means that you could pause for a moment, but otherwise only after the end of your shift was it possible for you to refresh yourself. So you didn't have a possibility that you have in a normal work life to have an appropriate and adequate break, to eat something, to drink something. No, absolutely not. And if we hoped for a 5-day work week, in any event, there was a special shift coming up. So there was always overtime. And healthcare provisions, if they notice that somebody cannot fulfill the target, and then you presume the person doesn't want to work, and then you put the person under arrest. That's one side. But the other question is, was there a medical healthcare provision available? Because there are people who are just not able to carry out that work and need a medical examination. Did that exist? With regard to healthcare provision, I can tell you something. Given the fact that the imprisonment was very long and that was a huge mental strain, and there are some cases where people were released again into the GDR, and I was afraid that this might happen to me. So I developed health problems. I had teeth ache, and the only thing they did at Hoheneck was extracting teeth. There was no dentistry or dentist treatment. And then the tooth got inflamed, and I had a fever, and I was really sick, and I was working the night shift. And I decided I couldn't get up. I decided I'm going to stay in bed. That was right before Christmas. That was the second Christmas that I spent in prison. So I said, I'm going to stay in bed, and if they beat me up again, I don't care. I couldn't get up. I was in such pain because of the tooth. And I was lucky that night. There was a guard who came in, one of the guards who wasn't that choleric and who wouldn't beat people up right away. And another cell inhabitant, she spoke up for me because the guard wanted me to get up and to get ready for work, and the fellow cell inhabitant said, "Hey, please have a look at that woman. She's in such pain because of her tooth, and she can't get up," and I was allowed to stay in bed then. So there was no general medical healthcare provision. It depended on the goodwill of the guards. In this case, as you just explained. And I have another question. Was there a mean to promote the performance of the prisoners? Yes, I mean, no. I was speaking in medical terms. What do you mean? You mean, or some medication, drugs, anything to strengthen, to be better able to exploit the prisoners and their work? I don't really know. I just know that pills were handed out by the plant's physician to calm people down, so to speak, because among the criminal offenders there were many people who had been in prison for so long, and they just freaked out, so to speak. And I heard that they were given medication. They did not try it with me. There were these cases, but if you weren't affected by that, that's good to hear. Thank you. We have 3 more minutes and 2 requests for the floor. Mr. Schirmer, please. I would like to take things to present time. You have started an administration procedure. May I ask why you waited for 30 years? And you just recently published your own biography. Have you heard reactions from other people affected, or is that too recent? No, indeed I have. I've been lucky that in our cell we were 8 political prisoners and very important women. There are women I'm still in touch with and I'm still friend with. And of course I gave them a book for free and I signed it for them, and they were very happy that I had written it. And with regard to your other question, yes, there was a reason why I waited for so long. I'm particularly talking about mental scars that are left. And I was unable to trust a psychotherapist. I was always afraid that it could be someone with a GDR past who would not understand me at all, or who would belittle my experience. In Wiesbaden, how many people would live there who would come from the east of Germany? There was the likelihood was very small. But then I thought, someone aged the age of my children, 30 to 35, people who hadn't been in touch with that topic at all. So there was no trust in me. And of course I spoke to my husband, who, because of his activity, professional activity, he had undergone special mental support. I was able to speak to our GP, or general practitioner. He was able to understand what I was talking about, but unfortunately he has already deceased. And my general practitioner now, she also has roots in the East. Her grandmother had experienced sexualized violence after the Russians, right after the war. The family had moved to Hamburg, and the granddaughter had to overcome all that. And I'm in touch with her. She is a psychotherapist as well. And so there's a lot of work ahead for us, for the 2 of us, because we want to really come to terms with that. Microphone, please. So if you agree, we would like to come to an end with that interview, because we are a little behind schedule. And now I would like to call the next witness, and that is Ms. Elke Schlegel.
Danke. Ich wollte mich mit den Worten verabschieden.
I would want to say goodbye with the following word.
Das Cottbus, Symbol des Sozialismus in Aktion. Für unsere Männer.
So this was the song that was sung in this prison here in Cottbus. Thank you. Ms. Schlegel, I would like to ask you to introduce yourself. Maybe take some 5 minutes, and then we will have a 10-minute interview round. Hello, I'm Elke Schlegel. I was born in 1958 in Jena, in Thuringia. I did 10 years of school, and after school I wanted to undergo professional training, but my favorite profession wasn't available because there was state control of who would be trained to do what profession. I then became an apprentice in another profession. I did a training in a hotel, wanted to work on a ship as a service assistant on the ship, but this was rejected because I had relatives in West Germany, in the US, and in Canada. My dad's siblings had escaped before 1961. So this is why they rejected my wish. I then gave up. I got to know my current husband. I became pregnant, had a child. I was then allowed to work as a stewardess, and then all of a sudden I was allowed to work as a stewardess also abroad, but then they had a means of keeping me back because of my child in the GDR. And then we filed an application to leave the country because I wasn't allowed to go to service and church. Free speech was prohibited to me. There was no freedom of travel. I wasn't able to learn the profession that I wanted. Elections weren't free. It was all manipulated. And if you wanted to go to elections, then there was this ready-made voting slip. So we decided to file to leave the country. We handed in 8 applications, and my city, Jena, was a place from which Jürgen Fuchs, Roland Jahn, and many other notorious people, Matthias Domisch back then, was killed in Stasi prison back then. So we were quite a group in my hometown. So we got in touch with people from the White Circle Freedom Movement. We were part of the freedom movement. Demonstration and protest was prohibited, but we went to the market square and held a white dove in our hands as a symbol, and we said there's nothing wrong about it. We are simply informing the general public of the fact that we do not agree to this regime. On the Day of Human Rights, which is the 10th of December in the year 1983, and I have to tell you on top of that, if you filed to leave the country, then you had to turn your back on your relatives. And I did that in the case of my brother. I stopped contact, and he was immediately called to military service in the army. And on the 10th of December that year, he suddenly stood there with a machine gun before me, and he had to arrest me, my own brother. So we were then taught by the military that we were to stop these activities, and I signed I would do so, after which our application to leave the country was granted, but then we were arrested just before we were able to leave the country. I was deported to Gera. I was tied to a chair that reminded me of National Socialist dictatorship. I had to travel to that place, or to a similar place that was similar to Buchenwald before, so I didn't even dare to go and take a shower because of the fear of being killed in the gas. And paragraph 219 was the only paragraph of the penal code that they could use against us. My Stasi file says that investigations had been going on against us, and that they wanted to put us in jail in order to sell us. So paragraphs 213, 214, and 219 were put in the charges, and finally the conviction was done via 219, which was a telephone call they tapped, which I had had with my cousin in Neuwied. In West Germany, I told him, we're okay, we can leave the country, can you find us a house? And this telephone call was tapped, and they used it as a piece of evidence. And this was a treacherous reporting of news to West Germany. I was charged with 1 year and 6 months of a prison sentence. I went to the Hoheneck prison. I produced ladies' tights and stockings. Then I was redeemed. And I was able to go to West Germany. In West Germany, I learned another profession. I became a sales agent for automotives. And I obtained further professional qualification in order to get back home from work. In West Germany, we had this group of people, and I met another woman who was also over from the DDR, and I told her that I'd arrived in 1984, so this was after the fall of the wall already, and I told the woman that I had been in prison, and she asked me which, and I said to her it was Hoheneck prison, and she told me she'd been a guard in that prison, and I don't know, I opened the door of this car, and I told her I have to get out. I had a nervous breakdown because I met that woman who'd been a guard at the Hoheneck prison, my prison, and I went into treatment, into psychological treatment since 2014. I haven't been able to work in my profession anymore. Thank you very much for introducing yourself. So the jury would now like to ask you about your work for VEB Combine ESDA, producing shoes. Mr. Lee. So you're not able to work in your profession anymore. Is this a recognized consequence of your imprisonment? It's a PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, I was diagnosed with. I went to see many experts. In the beginning, the experts didn't understand what I was talking about. When I told them about the detention, the prison conditions in the DDR, and they asked me what sort of story I was telling them, and I was telling them, I'm not telling you stories, I'm telling you the truth, and it wasn't easy to talk about it. And everyone is asking you, why did you wait for so long? Well, quite simply because it was not possible to talk about it, because the pain is so deep. And of course, this was the darkest hole one can ever be in. I couldn't think of anything worse, and nothing as bad as this could ever happen to me again. Not today. This is what a post-traumatic stress disorder is, after which my inability to carry on working in my profession was recognized, and next year I would have entered my age of retirement anyway. Okay, I have a question too. Ms. Schmidt spoke about the Hoheneck prison also, and she said she had to sew skirts. And what did you have to do? I produced ladies' tights, and I did nothing else. So it was well known via internal talks amongst prisoners. Criminal offenders told us that they were producing ladies' tights for the West. It was a 3-shift system. We worked 6 days a week. As far as I can recall, there was no break. We were allowed to, and as described before, you had to report to the guards if you wanted to go to the toilet. There was a blackboard in the hall, and chalk lines indicated whether the plan had been fulfilled or not. And in order to fulfill the targets, I had to do the hot forming of 2,400 pairs of tights. They were not dyed at the time, so they were white. And when you put them on the model, on the hot model, then they started emanating this hot steam, and this was like corrosive, and that would hurt your eyes, and the neon light, and there was no ventilation, no protective equipment, no clothing, and the tights were hot, like around 60 degrees, and we would always say we could make a scrambled egg on this bust that we had to pull the tights over, and we had no protective clothing, and we were just called to work, and then we had to go there and work 8 hours and then return. So if you had to do this unhealthy work, did you have a possibility to take a break? Were you able to sit down or escape from these evaporating gases? No, there were no breaks. I couldn't recall having had any breaks. I would just stand on my feet for 8 hours in a row, which is why I have such back pains today. You were able to go to the toilet, however, but guards made sure you wouldn't stay away for too long. And as said, you had to fulfill the target, so you wouldn't have had time, and I wouldn't have dared to stay away for longer. So if you weren't able to fulfill your targets, and I was in a cell with 42 other women, out of which 5 were political prisoners, and everyone else was criminal offenders. And they had taken away my child from me upon detention. And there was one educator whose child had been killed right in front of her eyes. So knowing that meant to me, you know nothing about where your child is, and there's an educator there, and maybe your own child is at kindergarten and is being assisted by someone who will kill your child. In remand custody already, I tried to contact my mother where my child was, but back in the time, I didn't know this. So I went on hunger strike to be able to speak to the father of my child. When I came to Hohenegg prison, I was only on 37 kilos of weight, and after 3 months, they redeemed me because I wasn't even able to survive prison. I would have starved, and then they wouldn't have received any foreign currencies for me anymore at all. May I ask you about the working conditions? You knew that there were different work commands or working units with different activities at the Hohenegg prison. Would you have been able to say, I only want to do the shirts? Would you have had a possibility to change your job? No, there was no possibility to change my job. I know in my Stasi file, in my records, where I read this part, I must have been diagnosed by some doctor at some point who made a note of this work being too hard for me because I was too skinny, but I was never placed somewhere else. Right to the very end, I would have to work there at ESDA. So you only knew that when you took a look at your records, your files. So if you weren't all that physically fit, Was there any forced examinations, or were you given any sort of medication to give more strength? Did you go to see a gynecologist? Well, in remand custody, I reported that I wanted to go to the doctor because I had lost part of my tooth. And I went to the dentist, and he used some sort of a chisel to work on the tooth, and then he hit the nerve, and he said, "Yeah, this is the tooth," and he said, "There's nothing there," and I was led back into my cell, and then I would put breadcrumbs in my tooth to fill the hole, and a toothache is so terrible, and once air touches the hole, it hurts so horribly. And then I promised myself that I never again would ask to see a doctor. But in Hoheneck, I was sent to an initial medical examination, and a female gynecologist saw me, and she wouldn't even change her gloves when in between her patients, which was so humiliating and so filthy, so dirty. And I told myself again, never again can you permit yourself to go and see a doctor while you are in this prison. But someday, might have been 2 weeks before my release, I had to go to the medical ward for some reason, and another prisoner was asked to take a blood sample, and she didn't even know how to do it. And these people had no idea on how to work a medical needle. So she pinched my left arm 5 times, and she started crying. I started crying, and the guards would just stand there, and now she was told to use the other arm, and finally blood came out of my arm. And to this very day, I don't know what this blood sample was taken for. Rumor has it that the GDR even made money on blood that was sold. One political prisoner I had become friendly with to escape from sexual harassment. We had said that we would make out as if we were a couple, and she waited for me, and I fell unconscious, so they took me up to the cell. I didn't weigh much at the time, it was no problem. So one last question. So you gave us the articles according to which you were convicted. But please, Ms. Ottmann, we have to stop it here. And Mr. Haidt, I'm sorry. I can see that still there are questions. And Badenam, we still have your question, but we cannot do this because we need to take a break now, amongst other reasons, because our interpreters should take a break. So we would like to say thank you right now. Thanks for your statement, Ms. Schlieger. I'm sorry, but we have to keep our time schedule also, and we're quite delayed now. Thank you very much. So now we have a 10-minute break.
Hast mich drauf? Ja. So, wir machen jetzt weiter. In einer Minute geht's weiter. Bitte jetzt alle reinkommen.
So we're going to and have a seat.
Naja, die. Gut, schon mal vorab, bevor es weitergeht, die Information.
Before we start, I would like to give you the information that we had scheduled another break from 4 to 5, and we would like to reduce it to 45 minutes so that we can continue now until 4:15, and then we are going to continue. Dr. Wart, please, Dr. Wart, you've got the floor. Well, as we said, we have to be very disciplined with regard to our schedule. This applies to us. The jury in particular, we are still talking about the garment industry, and another witness is Mr. Harald Stefan. So please introduce yourself briefly before you are going to be interviewed by the jury on your work for VEB Shoe Factory Weissenfels. Good afternoon, my name is Harald Stefan. I was born in 1955. I come from Thuringia, and I had a normal school development, 10 years, and then I did an apprenticeship. I did my military service, and then I returned to my work life. I was offered the position of a teacher trainer, as I was good at being with children and dealing with children and young people. I studied a postgraduate course of educational studies, and then the medium-range missiles, the Pershing missiles, came to the GDR. There was the peace movement, as you're all aware of, and the symbol that young people, the logo was also put on their cars, my students, and I was supposed to ask them to remove the slogan of swords into plowshares, and I was in favor of that, of this movement, actually. And then in 1988, during the school year, I was dismissed. I was separated from the young people I was working with. I was offered a pseudo activity in a company. I was isolated professionally, and there was a head of squad, now you'd call it a HR director today, and he had fled with our family from Silesia, with my mother's side of the family, at the end of the Second World War, and he had a favor attitude towards me because he knew my mother when she was a young woman. And I was informed by him that he had to write reports to the Stasi. I didn't have an issue with that, but he was almost crying when he told me, and he was about to retire, luckily, that in my Stasi file it was mentioned that my daughter, our daughter at the time was 2 years old, that she would never ever be able to graduate from the secondary school or study. That was predetermined already at that time. I read that later on in our file. I told my wife, so we were all trapped, and so we wanted to file a politically motivated application to exit the country. And we did that time and time again. And in October 1988, we were arrested. I was in the company, and my wife was at home with a child in her arms. And then what happened was what usually happened, remand custody, etc. And then we were sentenced to 22 months of imprisonment according to Section 220 of the Penal Code. And after the verdict was proclaimed, we were transferred to the youth house Halle, Frohe Zukunft, happy future. This brings us back to the topic of your work as a prisoner, and we would like to interview you on this period of time when you worked in the shoe factory, Weissenfels. Who wants to take the floor? Mr. Lee, please. I have a general question, if I may. Dr. Sachse reported before that the companies from the Federal Republic, like Aldi, Kaufhof, and Quelle, they purchased products from GDR production and imported them. The question is, these companies, do they play a role in the compensation? Have they ever apologized to the victims? I think this is important because we are working on or reviewing history, and so it would be even better if it had an impact in the past, because in China many products are produced in prison and they are transported to the West. I mean, the IGFM has drawn up a list of products that are produced in China in prisons and that are sold here. And recently, the US state of Oregon, a woman found a note saying that the product was produced by forced labor in a Chinese prison. And if we alarm the companies, if we hold them accountable, there will be less import of these products to the Western countries. And I think that is very important for the tribunal to take this into account. If I may add, this was the case as well in our case. The master craftsman of the shoe factory told us that this was a commissioned manufacturing for the shoe company Salamander. We sew seams for the moccasin shoes, children's shoes, and shoes for young people, for teenagers. That's what we were doing. Mr. Smith wants to take the floor.
Thank you. So were you aware that the products that you were producing were being sold in the West at the time that you were working?
Yes, we knew that.
And could you say a bit about the conditions in terms of rest and sleep during your time in the prison? How many hours per night on average were you able to sleep? Were you able to have days off from time to time, or no?
Also, wir haben die Zelle anhand der
So we measured the cell size, 20 square meters, more or less. We were 10 adult men. There was a toilet and 2 washing basins with an embedded built-in mirror. And after a few days, we were really quite, let's say, relaxed about defecating, and
I was sleeping on top of everybody in 3 rows, piled up on top of each other of beds. The beds were very narrow, I think 50 or 60 centimeters, no more. At 8 o'clock, we couldn't leave the cell anymore. We had to go to bed at 1 o'clock. We were woken up at 4, and we started our workday at 6 on time. During the working hours, it was like it was outside. We had outside of the prison, so we had a 15 minutes breakfast break, and we were a unit of 30 people that were let for lunch, out for lunch, and then we were brought back. The working conditions were as follows. The youth house, Halle, was absolutely overpacked, overcrowded, with political prisoners in particular. There were only 600 criminal offenders and 700 political prisoners. As we heard, there was a huge amount of people that had to be catered for. We were accommodated in a kind of cellar. It was a supply corridor with tubes to supply with water, electricity, gas. It was absolutely dirty, and a cellar window 20 by 40 centimeters. You couldn't see what was outside, no daylight, and these corridors, these hallways are not really illuminated. And there were chairs, no table, and a cardboard box with the leather parts in them, and we were supposed to sew 8 pairs of shoes per day, so 16 times the seams that we had to produce. And there's a trick. For men's hands, it's difficult to do that with a needle and a thread. The yarn was very thick, and from the very first day we didn't receive any protective device you could put on top of your finger. A leather kind of sleeve or jacket to protect your finger. We didn't receive that. It worked quite well, though, at the very first days, and it wasn't dramatic if you produced 2 pairs less. They wanted to have a good quality of the seam. That was what mattered. And if at the end it was only 7 pairs, that was no real problem, followed by sanctions. So the quality was what counted for the future shoe. And after a few days, depending on the how sensitive the fellow prisoners were, what happened was that the yarn cut into the palm of your hand. And this cutting, was hurtful, depending on the person. There wasn't even a place where you could put the yarn, so people tried to do it with the left hand. It wasn't possible. It was a permanent process of infections, of bleeding and pain. And as they had refused to give us finger stalls, it was obvious that people couldn't stand this over an extended period of time. I mean, as we were hurting, we were hurt. We weren't able to carry out this basically simple process because these problems with fingers were so severe that we didn't know how to continue the next day. It was very complicated, it was very difficult. I remember a fellow prisoner, he used to play in a philharmonic orchestra. I don't remember where. He was a very sensitive person, and he cried pitifully because he could no longer play his instrument. That was really traumatic. If you wanted to go to the toilet, you had to notify. There were even people watching you, so you had to use the bathroom while somebody was watching over you. You had to be seated the whole day. We were hardly allowed to talk to each other. It was a kind of depressing, painful work. Mr. Haidt, please. You already spoke about the working conditions. I would like to know, were there any accidents? And were there any was there any consequential damage, health damage, for you or for your fellow prisoners? And you said it was a youth premise institution, but you were adult already. Can you shed some light on that? Was it just called a youth prison? It was called youth prison. I didn't see any young adults 16 years old. The youngest one was 17 years old among the criminal offenders. And there were people who were 60 or 70 years old. So the whole plethora of ages, so to speak. And I assume they didn't know where to put the people anymore, because they were so numerous. And Mr. Steg has mentioned already, the situation was really dramatic, because the general conditions were designed in a way to deprive you of your dignity. It's not about focusing so much on forced labor. I mean, the purpose of the whole day was to deprive you of your dignity. I tried to commit suicide. No, I witnessed 2 suicide attempts. I didn't witness them really, but I saw the impact. So the guard said, "Hey, if you try to do that next time, please let me know beforehand, and I bring you a rope so that you can hang yourself because you're worth less than a dog." That was the comment made by the guard. One last question by Ms. Davatz. I didn't really fully understand. So did you work in Halle or did you work in Weißenfels? We worked in Halle, in the prison block, in the cellar, in this kind of a supply corridor. We were not transported anywhere. The cells were on the first floor, and we had our working unit in the cellar, in the basement, basically. So now we're going to turn to the chemical industry, and Mr. Sachs again will give us an introduction to the topic.
Dear jury, ladies and gentlemen, I ask you for your understanding. I will really be brief now to introduce the next industry because we want to keep the time. So who wants to know something about the chemical industry should read Justus Festing's book on forced labor in the chemistry production area of the GDR. And who doesn't like to read should watch the Report Minds TV documentaries, who, in a collaboration with us, produced quite a series of documentaries about chemical production in the GDR. And as it sounds so unbelievable, I would like to just make a note of this, and we will hear more about it later on. In Bitterfeld, there was chlorine production. Mercury was used as an auxiliary substance. The equipment was from the 1920s, but by the 1970s, the wear and tear had progressed so much that the mercury was leaking out of the equipment. So with a shovel, manually, and this is so unbelievable, you just have to imagine that. Just with a shovel and with their bare hands, prisoners had to collect the mercury and put it back into buckets. So there's at least 3 fatalities. And when it was clear that mercury intoxication was spreading, the prisoners were rotated. So we have a whole group of prisoners with latent mercury intoxication and poisoning consequences. And as this sounds so unbelievable, these days, today, it is so hard to find recognition for this medical case, and I wanted to explicitly point it out so we can finally discuss it in public. Thank you very much, Dr. Sachse. As a first witness for the chemical industry, I now call Mr. Holger Rossmann. Please introduce yourself, sir. Hello, my name is Holger Rossmann. I was born on the 9th of September. I'm sorry, I'm just a bit emotional now because it's really stirred up my memories hearing all this, and I've been through so much in my life, but this is what I want to talk to you about right now. I was born 9th of September 1951 in Hagenau in the north of Germany. I went to secondary school there. In 8th grade, I was suggested to move on to the higher secondary school, but that same year, my dad changed his profession from being a state judge to working for the church as a lawyer. So the conviction, the verdicts he was supposed to pronounce, the rulings he was supposed to pass, he could not reconcile with his conscience. But that same time, I was told that me too I would not be allowed to higher secondary school, which meant no university career. This is why after 10th grade, I graduated from school and I did a professional training, which did also terminate with a university admission certificate. And in 1970, when I moved from Teltow to Berlin to live with my sister, who was at uni there, I missed the last train back, and the next morning I got to know her pen pal, Christa, from West Germany. Christa and I felt immediately attracted, and then we met in Hungary, in Prague, in former Karlsbad, Karlovy Vary today in the Czech Republic. And that same year, I moved on to Mittweida, started studying electrical engineering. In the summer of 1972, I was traveling on my way to Oberwiesenthal on a bus, and I walked on foot to the border, and I wanted to go to Karlsbad in the Czech Republic, where I was checked and controlled. And they found one of Christa's letters, and they knew exactly what I was about to do, and that I wanted to meet her. And that Monday after that weekend at uni, I was told to come to the admin office, and then I was questioned about where I had gone on the weekend and what I was imagining for myself and Christa. And as a student at a socialist university maintaining a loving relationship with a girl from the West, this was impossible, and they told me this was impossible. And shortly after, I was rejected from university. So I had to work at a cotton processing production at Spindlersfeld in 1972. Me and my girlfriend got engaged. She became my fiancée. My mother unexpectedly died of the consequences of a wrong treatment of her asthma. So she died that year. And that really threw me over and put my world upside down. That same year, the Stasi, the state security, put up the pressure on me. They took away my ID card, so I wasn't able to travel to socialist foreign countries, and Christa wasn't allowed to come and see me anymore. So I wasn't able to see my fiancé anymore. And before I move on, just let me mention one more thing. Before 1972, an agreement had been entered, so Christa was able to come to the GDR using her car.
Sache war die im September, dieses Verbots,
so in spite of this ban on me traveling abroad to see Christa, the Stasi had still tried to recruit me as an unofficial assistant spying on a friend. This was what they wanted. I said no, and I made it clear to them that as a Christian believer, I wasn't able to spy on a friend. So in 1974, I stopped working for that company, the cotton company, and I was looking out for a new job. And on the 11th of February 1975, I wanted to start my new job. But on the 4th of February 1975, I went to the police and handed in my so-called PM12 document. And I wasn't handed back my regular document, and Christa wasn't allowed to come and see me. And then I was asked about my job, and I said, I have signed a new work contract, and I will start on the 11th of February 1975. And then I was told to start tomorrow, to start the next day. And I said, I'm going to Berlin. I will complain to the Ministry of the Interior. And then I was told, you will not do that. So it went back and forth. And in order to stop me from complaining, on the 6th of February 1975, I was arrested in the morning. And a fellow student who was at home that day to pick up her things was also arrested and was sent to remand custody for a couple of months. And with the search of our house, a document by Amnesty International to Mr. Brezhnev was found, who was collecting signatures to redeem political prisoners. So this is what made them believe that this was anti-state propaganda. I was then sent to Karl-Marx-Stadt to remand custody, where I spent 3 months. Then I was convicted for 1 to 2 years of a prison sentence according to paragraph 249. I was immediately deported to the Bitterfeld prison, where I was sent to work in the chemical industry at the chemistry combine of Bitterfeld. First thing, I was sent to aluminium production there, just a short time, but very strenuous work, physically hard. And my dad had filed for a permit to come and see me, and he didn't know that I had already been taken to a new prison, so he had to file for another permit. 2 weeks before he was able to come and visit me, he passed away. I went to the responsible officer and asked them to be able to attend the funeral, and they refused. And I said, is there no humanity in here? And he said, no, in here there is no such thing as humanity. So from the aluminium, I was sent straight to the chlorine, as we called chlorine production. So this was the worst time I lived at Bitterfeld. So that's us right in the middle of your working biography. I really have to stop you. I'm so sorry, because the jury has questions for you. And I would like to ask the jury now to really be very brief and concise with your questions. So brief answers and questions so we can keep the time, okay? Mr. Haidt, please. Well, I just made notes on administrative proceedings. Could you report about the administrative proceedings, the court case, and the consequential damages you've reported? Okay, in order to be able to speak about the damages, I must tell you what the working conditions were like. So I was with the plumbers, with the metal workers at Bitterfeld. So the metal workers were working in a hall, maybe 4 times as big as this one, absolutely enormous, very big. So there were electrolysis baths over there, and the mercury would be sent over the sodium hydroxide solution, and the prisoners had to work at the top. We had to repair tubes, which are conducts which led from the baths to the production areas or from bath to bath, and we had to change the flanges. And the main problem was that entering the hall, I only saw prisoners working there, and I was wondering why. And there were very few civilian workers who would be telling people what to do. There was no health and safety at the workplace, no measures in place at all, not even protective masks, only those. Well, and every now and then explosions happened, and chlorine gas would leak out, and we were just told that if chlorine gas escaped, then we would have to run to that part of the hall where there were no baths and where there were these bars and some fresh air. So this was the only part where we could go, and there was really nothing there. So about the chlorine, we had many people suffering acid-derived wounds or caustic injuries. And there was one thing that was so terrible to me, and this is what we've alluded to already. These baths had some seals which were often untied and had to be exchanged. But before that point, they stayed on, and then the mercury would leak out. And just imagine the mercury would leak out to the hall's ground or to below the bath to the basement. In the basement, there was a water canal, and everything that would sip in from above would sort of like sink into the canal. And there were also parts where the hall's ground was touched, and who knows what mercury is that when one drop touches the ground, then it's 1,000 drops, and there were cracks everywhere. There was mercury all over the place. The horrible thing that the temperatures in the hall were enormously high. Just imagine, the mercury evaporates at room temperature already, and as a metal worker, I had to go underneath the bath to loosen the flanges. And I knew that the mercury was highly toxic, but I didn't know just how toxic. And there was no talk about that. Nobody mentioned the fact that there was a reason for only prison workers working there. Civilian workers didn't want to come and work there. And just the way it is, the other prisoners would tell you that with time. It was because of the damages to your health, and also because prison workers work for very little money. And this is the inhuman thing. We were sent there with a clear knowledge of the consequences. They knew we would become sick. It was absolutely unavoidable. And one of these flanges For example, we called it, if the solution was to leak out, that we were asked to rinse with water, but if you are below such a bathtub, there is no water, so you'd always have some acid wounds or some caustic wounds. So the worst thing to me was that on top of the metal pipe, I saw the mercury droplets, and I would hardly dare to breathe. I was so scared. And then on top of that, the sentence was 1 to 2 years. It was open, so I didn't know how much time I would be spending in that prison, which is also a psychological strain, and this was something they used on purpose. They made people think that if they were extremely active there, then they would be released before. But this was just another inhuman aspect of imprisonment there. So thank you very much for your information. It's all very valuable, but we really have to keep the time. I'm so sorry. And there is another question here. Mr. Farts. Thank you. On the accident rate in your workplace, so there must have been permanent accidents. You've already spoken about the long-term consequences, but how about accidents happening throughout your workplace? Oh, yes, I suffered a severe injury, a severe burning in my legs through the hot liquids. How about acute work accidents? Did it happen there? Yes, it happened there. And what was the immediate reaction and response to that? So just a little example. I had to close a tap. There was a tube attached to it, and boiling hot water came out and burnt my legs. So this was rinsed with water, and they saw it, and I had to wait until the bus would take us back in the night. So of course there weren't buses everywhere, so we would be taken back to camp in the evenings. So I did not receive any medical treatment. I had to come back to work the next day. And then I started shaking, I had a fever, and I spent 6 weeks in the medical ward. And one day, Dr. Pollack, a notorious doctor, wasn't there, and then a civilian doctor came in, and he took a look at the wound and asked the assistant, well, what did you put on this wound? And then he was told about a solution that was used for a totally different sort of disease. It was, they had put a solution on which was for an athlete's foot, not for a burned leg. Okay, thank you very much. I would now like to call our next witness, Sylvia Krause. Thank you very much, Mr. Rossmann. I was especially happy that after prison I was released into West Germany, and after that I was so happy that my wife Christa waited for me all those time and all those years. Thank you.
Ms. Krause, I would also like to ask you to introduce yourself briefly. And I'll be brief, yes. My name is Sylvia Krause. I was born in 1958 in Greiz in Thuringia. I went to school for 10 years, and afterwards I had studied at a technical college to become a physiotherapist in Saalfeld. You've already got to know my husband. I'm the wife with the child. In 1986, we filed our application to leave the GDR, and we submitted it time and time again to put emphasis on this request, and we were arrested in 1988. I was at home with my daughter. She was 2 years old, and we didn't see each other again. From the remand custody in Gera, I was transferred to the Dessau prison with some, quote, particularities, unquote, I don't want to dwell upon. They would be too much and too painful. I was transferred to Dessau, as I said. You just imagine 700 criminal women mutated to men by hormones, repetitive perpetrators, people who've been in prison for a long time, and I was one of the 30 political prisoners who had to become a part of the pack, so to speak, to survive. We produced, for film manufacturers, we produced magnetic tapes for ORWO, RWO, and we cut the magnetic tapes into cassettes. Later on we had the cassettes, before there were tapes. And chromium dust was released from the machines, and only the political prisoners were assigned these tasks. Very attentionally, I was standing there at this machine without any exhaust gas ventilation system, no PPE, 8 hours in uncomfortable shoes, without protective masks, without gloves. And the young woman in front of me, she lost her right arm because the blades that cut the tape, you have to visualize it as a carpet coil or roll. The chromium dust band arrived, was put into the machine, and then it was cut with blades to 5 millimeters strips on coils, and you had to take off the product manually. You didn't only breathe in, you had the chromium dust stuck on your clothes, you had to sleep in your clothes, so you had to take off the coils, and they were then put into the magnetic tape. So it was a whole production process, ranging from the blanks, cutting, further processing, all the way down to packaging and dispatching the magnetic tape cassettes. We were working there, and at the time, the prison was overcrowded. Usually, the cell was for 8 women, and they just put in more beds. And we were 16 women in this room with 1 toilet, freely accessible for everybody, 3 washing basins. And we only had 1 pair or 1 set of clothes we had to be wearing 24/7, and we had to work in 3 shifts. Mrs. Krause, this already brings me to the working conditions. We are already fully involved in this topic about your work in prison, and I think it's a very good starting point for the jury to ask questions. Mr. Badanam, please.
Just a moment, please.
Between the female prisoners, was there...
Moment.
Okay. So between female prisoners, was there like male guards were there? So like because of the sexual harassment and rape cases, it happens a lot for the female issues. And if I would compare the North Korean cases...
Stop. Kann mir jemand helfen? Ich habe es doch eingestellt, aber ich höre es nicht. Okay. Thank you.
So briefly, was there any sexual harassment or rape cases? Did you witness? And if you report the case...
Ich höre gar nichts. Können Sie mal? Ich höre nichts. Vielleicht ist es leise.
Ich weiß nicht.
Ich kann Sie nicht verstehen. Jetzt? Nochmal? Nee. Geht tatsächlich nicht. Ja. Ja. Danke.
Channel 1, 2 Englisch, ja?
Okay, briefly, did you witness any sexual harassment or rape cases? And if there was any cases, then if you report it, it gets improvement of the conditions, or did they try to fix the problem at all?
No.
Nein. Man nannte das tatsächlich Selbstjustiz.
This was called self-justice, and it happened to me.
Weil, ja, an diesem Verwahrraum war diese...
There was a bathroom attached to the room where we were in. I don't want to dwell on the details. Maybe we should skip that question and ask other questions that have to do with the working conditions.
So you mentioned that the woman working in the workstation just in front of you suffered an accident in which her arm was cut. Can you explain the treatment that she received following that? And were there other cases similar to that at the workstations, accidents along those lines?
I didn't really see what happened. It was only reported to me, so I cannot really say anything else about that. I can only tell you that based on this information, and we work in a 3-shift system, I paid attention to not being injured by these blades because I wanted to reach the West healthily, and I tried bread on the heating and brought it with me to work to supply me with some calories, some joules, some energy overnight because it was very difficult, so I tried my best to stay healthy. I think if there are no further questions, we're going to dismiss you. I think that I see that this is very, very difficult for you, and we don't want to put too much of a strain on you. Thank you very much for your statement.
So I would like to hand the word back to Mr. Baumgart. Thank you very much, Dr. Barth. I think it's very important, after hearing these emotional words, to take a break now, and we will continue at 4:15 sharp to start the last block. Sorry, it will start again at 5 o'clock. I'm sorry, 5 o'clock.
Es gibt auch Kaffee und Kuchen draußen, ja.
And there's also coffee available and some pastry outside.
So, wir wollen gleich weitermachen. In 2 Minuten wollen wir weitermachen. Bitte Platz nehmen.
Ich hoffe, Sie haben sich alle gut gestärkt.
So I hope you've all had the opportunity to refresh a bit so that we can pay full attention when it comes to the last segment of industry we are going to speak about.
Zur Einführung in die Besonderheiten der Zwangsarbeit in diesen 3 Betrieben.
We are going to hear more about the topic by Mr. Sachse. He's going to give us an introduction. Ladies and gentlemen, dear members of the jury, I'll be brief because yesterday we heard Dr. Kill's presentation on Reichsbahn, and I would just like to remind you of what she said. We have heard quite a bit about Pentacon, which is one of the companies. So let me just repeat that prisoners were deployed by Deutsche Reichsbahn for the construction of new railway lines. If you read the reports, the camps were erected on a temporary basis. The prisoners were sometimes accommodated in freight trains during winter, as we know it from the Gulag. And it wasn't easy for the people. And then there were barrack camps that were built and dismantled again, and the living conditions were very poor. Accommodation, the situation got better when there were stationary camps that were there permanently. The prisoners worked at the track panel assembly. The prefabricated track panels were put together. That wasn't easy because the prisoners hadn't been trained for that, and they were very heavy. Old rails were disassembled and new tracks were assembled. The third type of forced labor at Reichsbahn was the repair and scrapping of freight wagons, and we're going to hear about that. With most primitive means, it was that these freight wagons were cut into pieces. There weren't enough lifting devices for the transport of the heavy goods, and the Reichsbahn repair workshop in Potsdam is an example for that, which belonged to the prison of Brandenburg-Gurden. You heard all that yesterday. I don't want to dwell on that any further. At Pentagon Cottbus, the situation was as follows. Case parts for the Praktika models were processed, were worked on. They weren't manufactured there, but these were quite simple works. It was done in home-based work, partly. Had the people had the right tools, very good working conditions, no excessive targets, that would have been a monotonous work that would have been feasible. But it was turned into unacceptable forced labor because there were no tools, no protective equipment. The risk to be injured was very high, and if that happened, the people weren't treated properly, or taken care of. All this would not have been necessary. It shows that it was a humiliation process, and obviously this was also done successfully, I assume. I'd like to leave it at that. I would just like to point out what we mentioned before, the Spriller card material. People might be tempted to say, well, that it was a little dusty there, but we are talking about carcinogenic substances that were used, and this is something that we have to be aware of and remember, and I'm sure that this is going to play a role when we're now going to hear the witnesses, and I'd like to leave it at that. Thank you very much on behalf of the jury for your introduction to the topics, Dr. Sachse, on behalf of the jury. And I'd like to call as a witness for the work on the repair workshop Brandenburg-Gurden, Mr. Peter Schneider is the witness.
Herr Schneider, ich bitte Sie, sich kurz vorzustellen.
Hello there. I was born on the 3rd of April 1962 in Bad Frankenhausen in the Harz region. My parents and I moved from Frankenhausen to Hellbra in 1964, where from 1969 to 1979 I attended secondary school, or lower secondary school, rather. Dr. Sachse alluded to one of our comrades who wasn't able to attend today, of the Mannesfeld Combine. We were actually used to work there as pupils over a time period of 2 years, and were used to work there once a week. In 1979, I graduated from secondary school and then started working at the railway company Reichsbahn in Hettstedt in Saxony-Anhalt. I then used the options the railway company offered for us to travel all Germany and also Eastern Europe at no cost, and to explore the possibilities to eventually leave and get to West Germany one day. Later on, I tried to escape from the DDR, from Hungary to Yugoslavia. Of course, I wasn't successful. I came back to Halle and came back to a Stasi prison, to a state security prison, and I was convicted, sentenced to 2 years of prison sentence because of repeated escapes to flee the Republic. Later on, I was transferred to the prison of Brandenburg-Gurden, the largest prison the GDR had at the time, primarily used for common criminals. my lawyer had told me that probably I would be arrested, or that I would be put in the Cottbus prison, but at the Cottbus and Bautzen prisons, there was no capacity anymore to take up more prisoners. So I was one of the few ones who were sent to the Brandenburg penitentiary. We assume that some 5% of the political prisoners were in the Brandenburg prison. Thank you for introducing yourself. The jury would now like to ask you about your work at the railway company's repair works. Professor Lee. Could you describe the working conditions? Well, back then I was 18 years of age, and I had been trained at Reichsbahn, at the railway company. To them, it was completely natural to use me as a forced laborer at the repair works in Brandenburg, even though there were other possibilities to use me. And the repair works of the railway company meant quite hard work, hard physical work. And I was 18 years back then. My body weight was 50 kilos. And we had to use a bar to sort of lever out the timber panels for the tracks from the heavyweight freight cars, and there were no protective measures in place. There was a helmet. Yes, we did use a helmet, but apart from that, no protective equipment. Could you tell us something about labor accidents and what would happen after that? How about medical attention? Well, once one of the track panels fell on my foot, but you will not be taken to hospital straight away. I had to wait and file for me to be taken to hospital to be x-rayed, and then a partial fracture of the bones was stated, but nothing was done about it. And what's important to know for the jury is that I refused to work in one instant, which was in the case of us working outdoors one day. There was extremely heavy rain, so work was interrupted. And everybody knew that I was a political prisoner. This was, of course, widely known because there weren't so many of us there. And I was supposed to clean the complete yard in the pouring rain. And of course, I refused to do that. So they came to get me shortly after. And the next days, I was left in the standing cell, as it was called, for the next days. Was there a hierarchy in the prison and political prisoners were at the bottom? Yes, absolutely, absolutely. In particular, in the Brandenburg prison, this was the case. After a couple of weeks' time, somebody came up to me and said to me that if I was to give them the money I earned, then they would protect me, so nothing would happen to me. And I gladly accepted that offer. And later on, I gathered from my Stasi records, from my personal file, I found out that there were even harsher arrest conditions in Brandenburg, where people were put who had refused to work, and where they put them for a couple of weeks even. And I read on the records that they had planned to do that to me, but those cells were completely overbooked. So a standing cell isn't really a nice experience either, because you have to stand there with other men in the cell. If you faint, you just fall to the side, but you can't fall down, because in a standing cell you cannot move. No way. You mentioned before that there was other types of work in general. Did you have a possibility to choose the job you would do? Were you able to choose your workplace and to refuse another? Well, I assume that they just thought, well, this guy has worked with a railway company before, or he was trained in the non-technical area at the railway company before, so they put me with Rossmann. But you weren't able to choose, were you? No, no. Okay, I have a question on work organization. Usually, groups would be put together, which would work in a brigade style with some sort of a foreperson or foreman. Who were your internal supervisors? Was it criminal offenders, or was it also political prisoners ever in leading positions? Well, maybe with the doctors. That might have been the case. Maybe political prisoners were used for work at the hospital, but at Reichsbahn, no. Under no circumstances could that have been the case. We had worked at Reichsbahn in 1982, and we really were asked to do the severest or the hardest work they had. So what positions were actually distributed to political prisoners? Like brigade foreman or supervisor of cleaning the room? Well, so what we had to do was to free the freight wagons from the timber using this big lever or bar, and then we would cut the bigger timber pieces into smaller ones, and came the crane, and then the parts, and also the iron parts would be put on another wagon, and then later on that would be put into the foundry. So everyone would sort of have their own departments. There was no supervisor, there was a master craftsman or master technician of Deutsche Reichsbahn, but they wouldn't interfere with production. If we were lucky, we would have seen that person just once. But apart from that, supervision wasn't done by those technicians. It would all be supervised by prisoners. So criminal offenders would supervise the works. Is that correct? Yes. Okay, I have a question about the consequences of the prison you suffered, and you also said that there's administrative proceedings ongoing. Maybe you would want to tell us something about that. Yes, that is quite recent. I'm now in year 13 of my lawsuit before the administrative court, the regional administrative court. The last court appointment was 2 weeks ago. We're still waiting for the sentence to be passed or for the ruling to be passed, but probably I will be rejected or my plea will be rejected. And this will probably be because the federal state that I live in, the federal state of Germany I live in, for 5 years has not recognized any consequential damages following work in prison. This is Saxony-Anhalt. So we have to wait for the court decision, and we've already stated some flaws in the proceedings, and then we will go to the highest level social court Germany has, the federal or the national court. So what sort of consequential damage are you suffering from? It's psychological harm, long-term harm. And it wasn't appreciated or recognized that for 10 years I haven't been able to work. It played no role in the hearing, and it played no role that I have a degree of 50% of handicap officially stated. So the court did not recognize that condition. And my lawyer does believe that the National Social Court would be the right court to turn to in this case, to appeal. Were there any punishments if you would not fulfill the plan target or the target plan figures? And well, just tell us something about the target figures of your plan. Well, I couldn't really confirm this. My comrade and I were the first ones to start production in that site, and at times Reichsbahn weren't even able to send any wagons or cars to be scrapped. Maybe for reasons of organization, I don't know. And I couldn't really say that there would have been punishments to not fulfill the plan. Of course, if I refused to work altogether, then that would be punished, but there was no punishment for not fulfilling certain target figures. Okay, with that, I close the hearing of our witness, Peter Schneider. Thanks a lot for your statement. Thank you. We will now move on to the next witness for VEB Pentacon in Cottbus, Thomas Schlieger.
So I'd like to ask you as well to briefly introduce yourself before the jury will interview you. Hello, everybody. My name is Thomas Schlieger. I was born in 1961 in Jena. My father was a trained miner in the GDR. My mother was a seamstress. And I went to the POS secondary school for 10 years. And then I trained as a floor tiler in Jena. And I started it and I completed it with a good result. And I then worked as a floor tiler. And at age 12, I changed my ideological attitude vis-à-vis the GDR, basically overnight, because my aunt and my uncle were arrested for smuggling of GDR citizens. My wife has mentioned it already. For these reasons, we filed an application in 1983, which was rejected several times. And so we had the permit already in our pockets. We were sitting on our suitcases. But early in the morning, on the 28th of March in 1984, we were arrested and were put in remand custody in Gera. I stayed there for 3 months. According to section 219, I was sentenced for illegal information transfer that could cause harm to the GDR. I was transferred to Cottbus. There's one thing I didn't know. I wasn't aware of where I was transported to, and that it was Cottbus, until I entered the cell block. And there I was explained the hierarchy of the prisoners right away, because I was the only political prisoner. So we had 3 beds. I was to sleep upstairs. I wasn't allowed to step on the beds underneath. So I had to get up there somewhere onto the bed. And somehow. I worked at Pentacon the second day. I thought the work was boring, and I thought, well, I could do something different. And I asked our cell chief, I said, hey, there's a construction unit. Could you please transfer me to this unit? And then I was hit by another prisoner on my chest, and he said, you're going to stay here with us. We are not going to allow you to ruin our plan, our target, because we have certain benefits we benefit from. We don't want you to ruin that. Thank you very much for your introduction. Now, as always, the jury has the opportunity to ask questions. Yes, Ms. Ottmann, please. You were the only political prisoner, if I've understood you correctly. Yes. And the criminal offenders who were in charge, they could have agreed to you being shifted to the other construction unit. Yes, I can say the name, Hans-Peter Hermann. He's died already. He was the chief of our cell, and he was in good connection with Arafat and RT. These were the two very important, brutal guys, let's say. In your sentence, was there stated that you were sentenced to forced labor? No. So you couldn't choose your work freely, or you could choose that to be used in the profession you're trained in. You were subjected to the prison and the prisoner's hierarchy. And had you refused to work, what would have happened? I wouldn't have been allowed to receive parcels or write letters or isolation. This happened to others. I had the opportunity to talk to my mother once. That would not have been possible anymore. That was what I knew what could happen. I didn't really understand why you could ruin the results of the others. Is the plan to be fulfilled? Did it have to be fulfilled by the whole cell? No, it's an individual target, but if some inhabitant of the cell, the others could also be punished. They couldn't write letters, they were not allowed anymore, or they couldn't receive parcels, they wouldn't be let into the yard anymore for fresh air. And the chief, Hans-Peter Hermann, he thought it was very important that everybody would meet the target. I met the target the first day, but then things went downhill. I'm also going to ask a question, if I may. You already described that if you had refused to work, there would have been a collective punishment. And the fellow prisoners exerted pressure on you to adapt. Were you aware of any cases of work refusal at Cottbus? No. I wasn't here long enough because I was bought free later on, and I left the GDR. How long were you in Cottbus? 4 months. That's not a very long time indeed. Mr. Haidt. I have a question to you. Consequential damage. I've read there are proceedings underway since 2013. Could you update us on that? In 2018, post-traumatic stress disorder was recognized. I still suffer from sleep disorders. I can't really stand bright light, neon light, for instance, which was normal during my work life. And then the noise caused by the guards, sleeplessness. We were woken up during the night, here as well, not only in the Stasi building. No further questions. I don't see any request for the floor, so you answered in a very precise manner. I'm grateful to that, but I'm also grateful for the information you have given us. And with that, I would like to conclude your hearing, and I call as a witness for forced labor at VEB Elmo Turm at Hoheneck, Miss Birgit Krüger, please.
Frau Krüger, ich bitte auch Sie, sich kurz vorzustellen.
Ms. Krüger, could you introduce yourself, please? Hello, my name is Birgit Krüger. I was born in 1945 in the city of Zeitz in Saxony-Anhalt. I graduated from lower secondary high school and then became an assistant for a chemical lab. After that, I started working at the oil refinery at Schwedt-Oder. I met my husband there, and in 1966 I moved to Berlin. With my marriage, I gave birth to 2 children. I came from a very safe home. My parents were, I don't know, of no determined political attitude, but it was only later on that I understood what this was all about. My husband was from Berlin, and his whole family had always had connections to West Germany. Someone from the family had tried to escape the Republic sometime earlier, and we would always be discussing it. And then we started speaking about a possibility to escape from the GDR, and I said clearly, this is not happening for me. I will not take this risk. We had 2 small children. In 1973, GDR joined the United Nations and ratified the Charter of the United Nations, which states that every person has the right to determine their own nationality, and every person has a right to leave their country and to return. And then I saw legal grounds for us leaving the country, and I said to my husband, we will try to leave the country. And then we filed applications to leave the country once, twice, 3 times. We were summoned to Berlin-Rückertstraße, where there was a specific authority. I don't know what institution actually would summon us there. And every week at my workplace, I worked at a facility, at a chemical facility in the lab at Dimitrovstraße in Berlin. I always worked. Sorry, I just lost my train of thought there. So, in any case, every week at work, I was called to the director, and there was a party secretary, someone from the state security, and over they would give me lectures, and we would be threatened, and we were told that it wasn't good for us to leave. And I told them, what do you want from us? We don't even have a house big enough to be a home for 4 people. We will live in a 1-room flat with 4 people. And eventually we turned to the Human Rights Society in Frankfurt on the Main in West Germany. They responded early 1977, around Easter, when Justus Vogt, sent us a letter, Mr. Justus Vogt, from Frankfurt in West Germany. So Justus Vogt wrote to us to not lose hope, and that he was sure that by Easter we'd be together in West Germany, and that he would do everything in his power to make sure we would be able to enjoy Easter. And then we turned to the United Nations, led by Dr. Kurt Waldheim back at the time, because the letters, my husband was a taxi driver in East Berlin, which is why these letters were not sent through regular mail, but with customers. He would drive around the town, so our letter got to the West directly, and we were notified by the United Nations that our matter had been referred to a committee for discrimination cases in Switzerland, and that we had been registered there with a case number. In the meantime, I believe it was because of that, because as I found out later on in our Stasi documents, the letters had, of course, leaked through. So on the 24th of October 1977, I was arrested at my workplace, and my husband was arrested at home. For 7 months, we were imprisoned in a prison in Berlin-Pankow, and then because of betrayal of the state, because of heretic comments against the state and some further charges, we were put in other prisons. I was put in the Hoheneck prison, and my husband was deported to Cottbus. At Hoheneck prison, I was placed with the electrical engine unit. So these were engines for washing machines. So this is myself. Okay, thank you very much for your personal introduction. With that, we're back to the subject matter, which is work in prison, and the jury, I'm sure, has questions for you. Could you tell us something about your working life or your everyday life and work? I can, of course. We had 3 shifts, though. When you would be on the early shift, you might have had to work also on a Saturday. Apart from that, there were many extra shifts we had to do. And Elmo was one of the companies that ordered products at Hoheneck. We would work in rooms with no ventilation, and you had to get the boxes with a little trolley, and you had to stamp the pieces with your own prisoner number. I weighed 53 kilos back then, and then we would go to the turning lathe. You would open your blouse, and then you would have hot parts flying around and injuring your body, and then you would have to use a drilling bit size 10 to do some drilling, and all this in piecework speed. So, of course, it was impossible to choose another job. It was just assigned to you, and back then I suffered a medical condition and had several slip disc events and several surgeries for the herniated discs afterwards. Were you put on medication at all? Well, the curious thing is that on the medical ward, well, the first question was, are you somebody who is staying in the country, or are you somebody who's going to West Germany? And when I said I would go to West Germany, then I got a certain injection that was injected into my body far too speedily, even though the injection has to be given in a slow way. And later on in my documents, in my state security documents, I saw that physiotherapy had been ordered for me, and I wouldn't know whereabouts in this prison there would have been a place for physiotherapy treatment. So no, I wasn't put on medication, no painkillers, just these injections as long as I was on the medical ward. And after a week, I had to go back to work. So during your work, were you able to take regular breaks? Yes, there was one regular break, which we usually spent in the toilet because we were thirsty, and that was the water tap. And, well, we would smoke and go to drink water near the sink, yes. So how about protective equipment? No, nothing at all. No, not even any protective goggles, working on the drilling machine. When hot pieces would be flying around. And then the mean thing was hot chips flying around. And then the mean thing was that there was only cold water. And once a week you were allowed a warm shower, and you had oil and lubricant on your hands and the like. And if you hadn't been able to fulfill your target, then you had you weren't allowed to take a shower. And then if you weren't able to fulfill your target figures, then you were told that your children would not be fed adequately. Well, in my case, I knew that my children were with my parents, with my step-parents. It's just that later on I found out that the Hoheneck prison never paid a penny to my step-parents. Sorry, not to my step-parents, I'm sorry. To my parents-in-law, where my children were. So the money that should have been paid to my parents-in-law through the prison to maintain our children was never paid to them. So you were speaking about your children. Were your children allowed to come? No. My daughter was 9 years old. My son was 11 years old. So during that whole time, you never saw your children? Well, I didn't see my children for 2 whole years. This was the worst thing. And with the state security, this was the biggest token they had in their hand, the biggest thing to use against me. Every mother will understand this. Of course, the interrogators knew exactly what to do and what to talk about to make us do what they wanted us to do. So the work was really dangerous. Were you trained to do this work, to carry out this work? No, not at all. I was a chemical lab assistant, as I told you. So technology, machines, I didn't have the slightest clue. So you had to work without any instructions, without any preparation, without any training. Well, it might sound cynical, but on the machine next to me, there was a woman working who had assassinated a child, and she had been in there for 16 years. And it seemed that she was feeling sorry for me. It was at times she would take some pieces out of the box that I had to work on, and she did them for me. So were there possibilities to actively recover after working? Was there any possibility to take a break after work or to have some active sort of possibility of recovering? No, not at all. When you would come back from a night shift, so tired and all day long, the loudspeaker would be on, there was music, or the units would be called to work or to a meal, and then the laundry would be brought in. There was no consideration whatever, and then you had to come into the courtyard, so everyone would be counted, and then no way at all, no possibility to recover. And apart from the night shift, during the day, for example, after an early shift in the afternoon, you weren't able to go in your bed. And I had a bed that was in the lower story, but if somebody would come in and you were on the highest story of the bunk bed, then you had a problem. Well, I would like to know what the consequential damage is that you suffered. So it says here that until the 10th of July, your proceedings were pending. 10th of July 2020, it says here in the document, your administrative court proceedings were pending. Is that true? Yes, because I filed the application later, and I've also been through cancer. I have a pacemaker, and have renal insufficiency, cardiac insufficiency. So there are some things that didn't quite fit in with the application. So I have a recognition to get a little bit more of an old age pension payment, but everything else has been turned down again. Okay, so I think we can close the interview with Ms. Krüger now. Thank you very much.
So this brings us to the end of our witnesses interview, and I close this hearing. Thank you very much, Dr. Barth, and thank you very much to all the jury members for listening to the statements of the witnesses, and thanks, of course, to all the witnesses who have been willing to declare. As you have noticed, it's been emotional in many instances, and we are very happy that you have come, and thank you very much on my part as well. Before I start my concluding remarks, I would like to give the floor to Mr. Dombrovskis again. Distinguished members of the jury, ladies and gentlemen, before we wrap it up for today and leave the jury to their internal consultations and deliberations, I would like to say a few words to the jury again. I'm also a former prisoner, but hearing it all from so many different witnesses in such a condensed manner, this is really, really moving. And I'm sure that the jury, when evaluating the statements, will come up with the result that forced labor of political prisoners in the GDR can't be considered as normal. But there's more. The witnesses express themselves with regard to the recognition of consequential damage and mental problems in particular. And the jury is independent in their decision-making, and I would kindly ask the jury to also shed some light on these questions and discuss them, because there's one topic that I also presented to the German Bundestag on several occasions. Even if in Germany it's difficult for us to compare the Nazi dictatorship and the SED-Diktatorship, in this specific case, the following applies. If SED victims were imprisoned for at least a year, imprisoned by the Nazis, they don't have to provide evidence. If they were imprisoned for a year, it's accepted. But when it comes to psychological problems of SED victims, they have to provide the evidence for it. And we were given very vivid examples of that. This cannot be acceptable, because we cannot expect these persons to spend the years that they have of their life, and the years are going down in numbers. We cannot expect them to spend this in court. So we want this to be perceived, and we are very pleased that there's an interest in this topic. And the SED victims and the victims of communism don't have any claims that are absolutely unacceptable. We are talking about dignity, acceptance, and recognition. And in the field of forced labor, nobody expects a forced laborer's pension to be the outcome. That's not what it's about. Let me give you an example. IKEA, Christian Sachs, we discussed with the group headquarter, and they also funded some studies. And IKEA was willing to pay a double-digit amount, millions. But they said, we don't want to be the only ones, because there were more, there are others. And Ms. Kill of Deutsche Bahn presented her scientific work on Deutsche Reichsbahn, the railway company, and forced labor, and the then CEO, Mr. Gruber, said at the time when he presented the study that that Deutsche Bahn thinks they are obliged morally, but there is a shareholder, major shareholder, and that's the federal government. So I'd like to ask the representatives of the federal government, if we want the industry to voluntarily pay money into a fund, this is only going to happen if the federal government supports us in a certain way. And to this end, I would like to tell you a Facebook post posted by IKEA, a former prisoner who is here, gave it to us. And I would like to paraphrase and tell you what it says. It wasn't Facebook, it was Twitter. So IKEA says, IKEA apologizes that against the strict guidelines, products were produced using forced labor in the GDR. For years, we've been contributing to reviewing this past to come up with a binding compensation to the different parties. So this is a recent topical post made by IKEA, and if such a large company is willing to do something, I would like to ask the politicians to support us, to speak up, and to see how they can help us in the interest of the persons affected. Although this conference hasn't come to an end yet, although in this very group we will not stay together tonight, this is why I would like to thank all those who prepared this meeting. The UOKG employees and the Human Rights Center, all the technicalities can be solved. But the preliminary work with the contemporary witnesses, preparation of the documents for the jury, this is a huge amount of work and coordination efforts that have to be done. And this is why I would like to thank Sandra Cech, our project manager, for everybody who worked with her. And please come up here and I will give you some flowers. Thank you very much. I hope you enjoyed the conference so far. Thank you. So that was my appeal at the end of this day. Okay, so how are we going to continue? Dinner will be served. We have some food packages for you, and then at 7 o'clock there will be the first round of consultations for the jury, and we will show you where the rooms are. For our audience, everybody else and the witnesses, starting at 7 o'clock or a little later, we have the possibility to get together in this hall to have an exchange of experience, of opinion. This is not going to be streamed, and it's just an offer, not an obligation. And at 8 p.m. we'll have a musical impression of a prisoner's day. A saxophone player will play for us, and this exhibition that we see here today and that we're going to describe tomorrow in greater detail can be rented, and you can order it with Ms. Neumann-Becker. And there are always some leaflets as an information, etc. So if you want to rent the exhibition, you can do so. Mr. Marion Smith already announced that he wants it to be translated into English and to be transported to Washington. So we take you up on your word, Mr. Smith. So that's it for tonight. And tomorrow morning we are going to continue with the guided tours. And there are 2 more hours for the jury to discuss the matter, and at 11:30 a.m. hopefully we'll have a verdict, a joint verdict, a declaration by the jury. So thank you very much for today, and the media will also be here at 11:30. Thank you. So please hand in all the headsets, the receivers, and Thank you.
Bin ich noch drauf? Ja. Vielen
Can
Dank
you
auch
still
noch
hear
an die
me?
Dolmetscher.
Thanks to
Sie
the
haben,
interpreters.
sehr
Our
hart
moderator is
aufgenommen
kindly
am
saying
Tag.
it's a very
Ich
tough
glaube, es ist auch noch mal ein
work. It's been a
extra
long
Applaus
day,
von
and this
allen,
deserves an extra applause
da, weil das wirklich ein sehr
from
langer
everybody
Tag
because
war.
it's been a
Vielen
long
Dank.
day. Thank you very
Und
much
auch
from the
an
booth.
alle
It's been a
anderen.
pleasure. And thanks to everybody who was here.